as,
Okay, go ahead.
okay.
I'll just we'll kind of we'll just go ahead and get started with me and you just talking about the book, and then if people want to join us later, they can. Otherwise, they can watch this. But go ahead and say what you were going to say about the book, Betty.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that at this point, I read the book as a book. I read it as a flowing thing. I don't have those specific questions we did in mind anymore. I just have the way I have any book, an overview of what he was saying, starting with subjectivism versus theology, or the tale, as he puts it, and then progressing into the kinds of philosophies that have popped up and been very popular, and some still are, as against the Tao. And then the third part, to me, said, if you follow the logical conclusion of any of these pseudo-theologies or worldly theologies, you come to self-destruction. Of course, what he said in the second part is that all of them, at one point or another, in order not to self-destruct, actually use the Tao, but they won't admit it. And I've seen that time and time again. When I was a churchgoer, I was absolutely into subjectivism, and the church that I went to was extremely liberal, and it was New York City. So it's probably,
when you say churchgoer, what do you mean? Just kind of going to different churches?
No, I had my own church with the church that my parents went to. And no, what I meant is that I didn't have a real relationship with Jesus. I didn't even know it existed. I just went to church, probably for more social reasons than anything else. And when I look back on it, I remember people there that I think did really follow Jesus. But the crowd that I knew and I was in was mostly for social reasons and for the acceptance you get at church. Church is one of the places that will accept you until you become unacceptable, as opposed to other social organizations that you're unacceptable until they accept you.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It just isn't enough. And I have fond memories of going to that church and the people that I knew there. And
how do you think subjectivism impacted you at that point?
Oh, I got to the point where I said to myself, well, I can do anything as long as I don't hurt anybody. But actually, I was hurting people right, left, and center. But I accepted that philosophy because it helped me to be selfish. I mean, that would be my prime example. I accepted the fact that that when a fellow parishioner asked me to work for him because he knew I was looking for a job at the time, and I knew that it was a subtle invitation to adultery, and I was not interested, but I was not aghast. I certainly didn't have any hard feelings toward him. I just went, I have another job offer, thanks anyway.
Mhm.
I mean, it was all
Like
subtle in a
your
way.
decisions were more made not necessarily based on something being right or wrong objectively, but just being on what benefited you or what made you feel good about a decision or feel bad about a decision.
But my ego was either fed or hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember talking to God. I did pray, and I remember at one point going to various churches to see if there was more. But I know now that they existed, but they didn't exist in the circles that I was running in. I was going to the other famous churches in New York. Well, I wasn't a Catholic, so I didn't go to St. Patrick's, but they all were teaching the same social message. And so I said, well, if they're all teaching the same message, I might as well continue going to the church that my parents brought me up to go to. And there were many good things about it. But and they taught morality, but in a very, very liberal way. In a funny way, many of the things that I was taught there lines up with Catholicism more than Protestant. The acceptance of all kinds of people without any overlay of prejudice. Not even, it was a wealthy church, but not even in that respect. If you weren't wealthy or you needed money, they surreptitiously helped out. And so it was very accepting of all kinds of people, which in those days was a little unique. And the other churches that I tried were just fancy. And I went to the Dutch Reformed Church of Norman Vincent Peale. And I remember when the collection plate went around, he said, I don't want to hear it. In other words, he didn't want any coins.
Mm-hmm.
And I went, no, that's not very Christian. But he was into money. After I moved to Texas, I ran into a lady who was his first wife. And she said he never really gave his life fully to God until they were at a pastor's meeting and he went to the altar. And I said, what year was that? And she told me, well, I had gone the year before. So he really was just, well, I mean, he was teaching the successful way to live in a big city that's expensive. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think, like with the book, not necessarily getting into specifics, but like with our world today, like what do you think it teaches us? What do you think, like looking ahead to the future, what did you learn? Again, not necessarily getting into specific controversial things, but kind of a general lessons.
Uh-huh. Well, I think what impressed me most was the middle chapter, when he revealed in ways that I just never thought of before, how a moral value must come into whatever intellectual path you might find, or self-help or anything that because in the end, it will not sustain itself without going into a objective right or wrong position.
Mhm.
And I don't remember his details anymore, but I was very impressed by some of the ones that he mentioned, and how as it was getting closer and closer to a logical end, they actually had to go back to the word.
Mhm.
And
To an objective value, an objective truth. Yeah.
because he was, I looked it up. He was teaching at the University of Durham, North Carolina, when he gave these 3 lectures.
You mean like in Oxford or in England?
Oh, here in the United States.
Oh, okay.
University of Durham, I think, is in the United States, but maybe there's one in England.
I think he was in England at the
I
time.
think there's one in England. We name them. The 13 colonies, named
Mhm.
a lot of them, in February 1943. And so he was talking to young people, university-aged people,
Mhm.
in 1943. Now, I can remember 1943, I was still very young, but I certainly can remember that the only philosophies I heard were of this subjective nature.
Mhm.
And I'm wandering, I think. So I saw very clearly in that second chapter how, in the end, he talks about instincts
Mhm.
as one of those things. And I think I made a remark online that your instinct is to duck when something is thrown at you. But
Mhm.
instinct is not a philosophy you can live by. It
Right.
doesn't make any sense. Uh, and even that which normally would not make any sense to anybody, if you follow it into the conclusion that you've got to go to, when we're talking, I say the word, he used the word Tao because he was in a secular uh, environment, and he wanted to make sure that the people in his lecture hall didn't think he was giving a sermon.
Mhm.
But basically, we can say the word of God, because in the end, the Tao is a version of the word of God in various large religions.
Mhm. Yeah, I think he would say that there's this underlying universal objective truth, like what we would call the natural moral law, and that it can be known by people regardless of their custom, their culture, their religion. So, like in the appendix, he has the Hindus, the Confucius, the Jewish people, the Christian people, and quotes from them recognizing that there are these moral objective truths. And what the church would say, and what like Thomas Aquinas would say, is that there are some foundational objective moral truths we can know, the natural moral law, but we need to dive more deeply and develop them and expand on them. And that's where you can start to have misinterpretations, misunderstandings, errors can creep in. Cultures may misunderstand some of the natural moral law, but it's still, if you continue to go dig deeply, at the root of everything is this objective moral truth that people can recognize because of who we are, who God made us to be, and the type of universe we live in, and that it's really inescapable. So even if you deny this exists, ultimately you can't get rid of it just by your denial. Just like if you want to deny gravity exists and jump off a building, you're not going to refute that. Gravity still exists no matter what you believe. So people like subjectivists who reject the objective truth and natural moral law, they still just their rejection does not make it go away. It's still there. And I think, like you point out in chapter 2, he continues to show that the subjectivists ultimately have to depend on some objective truth in order to not have chaos and anarchy or tyranny. They have to ultimately come down to, at the end of the day, some objective value, and some objective value that they will promote, whether it is duty or preservation of species or kindness. I mean, whatever it is that they say, well, we all need to accept this. It becomes a self-refuting argument for them to say there are no objective truth, and then them to say, well, but we should at least preserve the species by how we act. Well, that's a self-refuting argument, because preservation of the species and acting for that would be objective truth that we would all want to agree with, essentially. So yeah, I think I've heard a lot of different comments in our weeks through the chat boxes that everyone has found this to be a pretty powerful book and pretty prophetic book. But Lewis was seeing it already at that time, what was happening with subjectivism. As you mentioned it, that it was popular at that time as a popular worldview, becoming more popular, and it's continued to influence the world. And you've had various branches of it kind of arise. I mean, you have subjectivism. Related to that, it's going to be other things like relativism and emotivism, where you just base things on emotion. So you have kind of branches off this subjectivism. This idea of just what some people call like expressive individualism, where you just, it's your own truth. It's a form of like relativism. So it's just continued to get broader and broader as to where this is applied and where it influences us. One of the things that kind of made me think this book kind of drew out with me is, it continues to influence us today. And even for people like us who accept the existence of an objective moral truth, subjectivism can still influence us because of the world we live in if we're not careful. And so I kind of looked at it as, well, Lewis points out how you ultimately get the conditioners and the conditioned, the people who are in a subjectivist world, the people who are pushing their ideas, their agendas, their ideologies, and then the people who they are trying to persuade or coerce to accept those views. And so I was like, well, this is prevalent today. So how can I protect myself from being not being conditioned, one of the conditioned? How do I protect myself against propaganda and against these persuasive ideas that are actually misconceptions or misinformation? And so that was one thing that kind of stood out to me, is like, what can I do to kind of be proactive in this world where subjectivism is prevalent, of not falling prey to some of their techniques of persuasion and propaganda, because it happens all the time, all the way everywhere around us. Even if you believe in truth, that there is objective truth, there's a lot of things that we don't know. So for myself, like, I'm not that knowledgeable in economics or in, there's a lot of political things I don't fully understand. And so there's areas where we may have a gap in knowledge and not understand truths about things. We could be prey to people, to propaganda on all sides. It doesn't matter really what political persuasion you're in or what economic theories you believe. Someone like me, who I would admit my ignorance about some of these things. So I was thinking, how can I protect myself from propaganda, from subjectivists, because they exist everywhere, whether it's in philosophy departments or economic departments, political departments. And so that was one thing I kind of took away, is trying to improve my ability to think logically, think reasonably. I started to read some books about cognitive bias and how can I be aware of cognitive bias and then, protect myself from that. So that was one thing that kind of stood out to me.
Yeah, and I have to say that um, people who have born or lived here for most of their early lives, where you're being fashioned to understand and whatever, uh, you're really so protected here in Texas, and particularly in a city like Tyler. Uh, Imagine what is thrown at you in a big city like Chicago or New York or San Francisco. I mean, you're bombarded um, by this. I won't call it instinct. I will call it something that God has placed in everyone to look for uh, something to worship, and that's how things like communism, for example, became a religion, the religion of the state. And it was a perfect, to me, it's an example, exactly an example of what happens with that in the third chapter. Communism totally fell apart because they wouldn't give up their theories. And the people who believed in them, it was like a religion. And I don't know how much you were exposed to that as a young person in Texas, but as a young person in New York, I was constantly exposed to people who were sincerely uh, preaching. Uh, and if I have never read Das Kapital, I skimmed it once, but it sounds so good. It sounds so wonderful. It sounds like a good religion. Everybody shares. Nobody has too much, except that some people will take.
Mhm,
And the people who need the most are the ones that get taken from the most.
mhm,
And eventually, the whole thing fell apart. Uh, uh, Nazism fell apart in no time at all because they were very fanatic in their religion, so to speak. Uh, they because they uh, well, anyway, I don't want to go into that. Uh,
mhm,
uh, and your definition of saying that gravity, if someone says that gravity is not true and jumps off a building, that's exactly what his third chapter is about.
mhm,
If you jump off the building, when you land, you're destroyed.
mhm,
And I I wouldn't want anyone to read that book and think that he thinks that destruction is inevitable, uh, because I think that goes back to this middle chapter, and that is all of these people, when they, generally speaking, because there was some that would die for communism and did, but for example, but most people have that basic instinct of survival and will go to the objective word because they've reached the end of it and they're not going to continue, as he does in the third chapter, to absolution.
mhm.
Uh, so, I mean, I don't think anybody who read the book thinking that it's inevitable. Uh, it's not. It's a rare. It does happen. It does happen that people actually die for something that is false, but it generally most people will stop at the edge before they
Mhm.
jump and look down and say, maybe gravity does work.
Yeah. Yeah, I also agree. I don't think that he was trying to be pessimistic in the sense of it's inevitable, but I think he wants to call attention to this and
Mm,
say, everyone, pay attention, because this could affect you in your own life, plus on a wider scale, society. What are we doing to help protect ourselves and protect society from this influence? I think a lot of it is asking the deeper questions. What is truth? What is the meaning of life? Why are we here? But also to look at the deeper questions of, are we using our gift of reason, and are we using it appropriately, versus letting our emotions take control of what we think and do? And then even when we do use our gift of reason, is it grounded in the Tao, in the natural moral law and objective truth, regardless of your religious background? Are we using our gifts in balance? Like kind of the when he uses the example of men without chests, the ideal is a person with both a head, a chest, and a belly, all three working together in a balanced, ordered way. Not the emotions taking control, but also not reason without the Tao, without the emotions. You need all of them to be together. And so what are we doing in our life to help cultivate our gift of thinking, our reason, our logic? What are we doing to ensure that we're staying grounded in objective truth? And I think that he's trying to show us this is a way to avoid these dangers of subjectivism. But I also think he wants to point out why it is that sometimes our conversations with people can be difficult. Like at the very end, in the end of the 3rd chapter, when he talks about that window looking out into the garden, and how he says that you have a window that's transparent looking out into a garden. The garden's really there. It's material objects, it's things that you can look at. And then he says, but imagine that if you looked out of the transparent window and the garden itself was transparent. And so he's comparing a world with an objective view is looking out of a window, seeing the garden, versus a subjective view. You look out the window and the garden's invisible. There's nothing there. There's nothing to see. And then imagine those two people trying to have a conversation about a garden. And so I think he's also telling us this is why conversations and debate can be difficult. So we do need to try to understand where the other people are coming from when we engage in conversation. Doesn't mean don't engage, but realize they may be coming from totally different worldviews. And so rather than speaking around each other, try to understand their worldview and then try to explain your own to them without trying to assume they know where you're coming from. So I thought that was important too at the end. Is I don't think he's being pessimistic, but just saying this is reality, protect yourself from it, but also understand when you engage with dialogue, which we should have, this is where some people are coming from, and kind of realize that when you have these conversations, don't become frustrated. Don't become completely polarized where all you do is speak ideologically to each other and you're just shouting and yelling and never, building from common ground. But really try to have fruitful dialogue and see where they're coming from and find something you have in common, and then build on that. But so I think he kind of also wants us to see that too, maybe.
Well, I mean, it's a perfect example of what's happening today. And I really don't know what the statistics are because I don't delve in the kind of politics that's going on today. And although I do Facebook because of my ministry background, my friends on Facebook are mostly staff members who have scattered all over the world, and that's how we get in touch with one another. Max always joins me on Zoom. Sorry.
That's all right.
And I lost my train of thought. Thank you, Max. I will, if I find it again, but I will say that it was very interesting because the book that I bought was a very peculiar looking book, and I didn't know it when I bought it. I thought it would be looking like a book, but it was like very large. But in the back, they had all the definitions of his Latin phrases, all of the major religions and their thoughts, and then a list of negatives of the Tao and positives. I mean, it really had a wonderful appendix.
Do you have your cop version with you?
No, I have it in the
Oh,
other room.
okay, that's okay. That's
That,
okay.
yeah.
But yeah, this is After Humanity by Michael Ward. I mentioned it a whole lot, but he does the same thing. He kind of does a commentary, kind of defining terms, explaining people and places that C.S. Lewis mentions. Since C.S. Lewis is speaking to a very academic audience in the Oxford area, so he assumes they already know his references, which the readers today are less likely to know. So Michael Ward and others, you can find it online too, different people defining these terms and people and places. So yeah, if you do read the book, I think something like that is helpful, or like the version you had that has it already there in the back with the definitions is helpful.
I think we were talking about it not being a pessimistic conclusion, but that we should become aware, and that's where that we have to become aware of these things that sound so good, and that's what I'm going to, and it's true of a lot of these things. Well, that's how heresy has gotten into the church from time to time, and that is you just veer slightly, but as you go along, sorry, I have a duck in my phone. As you go along, it widens and widens to the point where it's very far from your original theological base, and then reform has to be set up about. So as individuals, I think that what we should be doing is gently talking to people who are veering off. And that's one way that we can see it, by asking God to show us how we can help. And I really, really think that that God does protect us, and there will always be opportunities for people who want to go further, want to go deeper, who have a desire to, and everything is available, especially in the Bible Belt.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is a good analogy to talk about, Christian history and how heresies have come about. But even like from, if you want to kind of look at it from C.S. Lewis's standpoint of even not necessarily bringing in like Christianity, people like G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, I mean, they always would talk to a crowd that was not necessarily in agreement with their religious views, but in such a way they could still emphasize moral truth, objective moral truth. And you look at the books like Narnia or The Lord of the Rings, within those is good and evil, right and wrong. And it's kind of geared to an audience of any religious background, even atheists. If you don't even believe in God, there's still this connection to humanity through those books. And I think they're trying to give us lessons about how you can evangelize people without even necessarily starting off with the starting point of God, Hi, Matthew. How are you?
And because he was so brilliant, both Chesterton and Lewis were able to write so that ordinary people could understand the principles involved in Tolkien when they use fantasy. Lewis wrote a trilogy that's not as well known as Narnia, but is more specific to that point. And it's actually science fiction trilogy, but makes his point a little clearer.
Yeah, I think they both would want us to be careful with becoming ideological to the point of where we become closed-minded. I think they all would, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and Chesterton would all say that we want to avoid polarization where we completely are just arguing with each other. Polarity, I talked about this in my last video that I did, but polarity is that we might disagree on things, and that's okay. Disagreement is not a problem. I put in my last video that I did that love accepts disagreement. We can disagree with people on some things. You know, we may disagree on what's the best economic approach or political approach to things. So disagreement's okay. It's good to have dialogue and debate, but we just want to be careful and not become polarized to the point where we demonize people who disagree with us. And so I think Lewis would want us to avoid that. Like at the end of this book, I think that he's trying to tell us throughout this book, he actually even says, I'm not saying that subjectivists are bad men. He said they're not bad. It's not that they are evil and trying to promote wrong. It's just that they're misguided. And so I think he wants us to recognize that people have different perspectives. They're not always in accord with truth, but we don't want to demonize people who disagree with us. We want to lovingly have conversations and have dialogue and evangelize and promote the truth, but avoid becoming ideological and polarized to the point that we can't listen to people, because we can learn something from everybody. Even people who disagree with us can teach us something. And sometimes we may be caught up in views that we have held to be true, which maybe are not. And I think about this when I evangelized if you think about it from a religious perspective, from Christianity, there are many people who aren't Catholic. And throughout their life, I've talked to people, and throughout their life, they believed sincerely that Catholics believed X. But then in talking to them and explaining what we really believe, they realize, oh, wow, I misunderstood. But I think this happens in all areas of life, whether it's politics, economics, philosophy. We could be caught up in views that we have held for so long, we think they're true. And so we need to listen to the other people. And I think Lewis would say that is that part of this is to make us aware of the subjectivist worldview that exists. It's not right. It's not the correct worldview, but don't demonize people, listen to them, figure out where they're coming from. It's possible people have just been persuaded all their life this is true and have never heard a refutation of subjectivism. So be patient with people, and in charity, speak to them about this subjectivist worldview. So I think he would emphasize that too, probably.
Well, I mean, it's never more true than it is today,
Mm-hmm.
where people have not only been polarized in their thoughts, but they feel free to exhibit hatred and anger at those they disagree with. And there's no hope of dialogue when a person says, I'm right, and if you disagree with me, you're evil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's what is happening today. And as I said to you before, I don't permit any political activity on Facebook. I just have it so I can contact people that I lived in community with for years, and they live in Australia and they're back in Europe and what have you. But if one of those people get caught up in a political statement, you have this little menu that you can go to, and I just leave them alone for a while.
Yeah. Yeah.
And because it's very, very difficult to have a dialogue with someone who says, I hate you.
Mm-hmm.
I wish you, I wish bad things for you.
Mm-hmm.
The, the opposite of agape.
Right.
And I don't think anybody is immune to it these days.
Mm-hmm.
So Lewis, in his wisdom, this particular book particularly was being played out right in front of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think people on their own individually can choose like how to engage, but we do have to be careful, and doesn't mean you shouldn't engage. I think C.S. Lewis would say, you know, definitely have dialogue and conversations on a variety of topics, but be careful and be aware of your knowledge gaps and where you're getting your information and how you're getting your information, and be careful because subjectivism is everywhere, on all sides of every issue, whether it's like I mentioned earlier, whether it's a social issue, philosophical issue, political issue, religious issue, you can find subjectivism there. And people may not always be aware that that's the worldview they're promoting. Some people are intentionally promoting it, but others, that's just what they've grown up with. And so, hey, and so people are prone, they may not even be aware that they're prone to it, or that that is something that they're promoting, is this subjectivist approach to something. Because some people may have religious objective truths that they hold, but then when it comes to a different area of the world, a different issue, they may have this subjectivist tendency. And so like I mentioned earlier, I think that really kind of helping to hone our ability to think logically, be aware of the cognitive biases that have influenced us. I just have become really, really interested in this cognitive bias thing lately, just because I've been reading some books about it as a result of C.S. Lewis's book we just read, is how people use things to persuade us, and how is propaganda used, and how is persuasion used on all sides, no matter what the view is. We can even look back in history and see how it's been used. And so, I mean, I think kind of looking at that, helping to arm myself so that I can try to recognize, okay, here's the tactic being used. It doesn't mean that someone's not promoting truth with that tactic, because we use it all the time. You know, we use these techniques of how to persuade people all the time. It doesn't mean they're wrong, but we want to just be aware of how truth is being communicated, or how ideas and opinions are being communicated, and being careful to not just let our emotions take over, because then it starts to become this subjectivist approach, is just letting your emotions dominate how you think and what you believe and what you hold to be true. Is just letting that emotion take over, not, and disregarding logic and disregarding reason, disregarding the natural moral law. And so kind of being attentive to that is kind of one of the things that's really just stuck with me from this book.
One of the problems is that a lot of people accept subjective influence because it's comfortable, because they don't have to think it through, because they don't have to look at both sides of the argument and make up their mind what they believe. They want to hear from somebody that they I don't know, maybe they're handsome or prettier than most, to put it at a most level, facile level, and they're comfortable there. And it's, I've had conversations innumerable times, I can't even count, where I say to somebody, you know, why did you decide that you believe this? Did you, you know, did you look at this side and you look at that side? Oh, no, of course, with the technology today, what they said is, oh, no, I watch this TV program and I believe everything they say and I don't have to look at anything else because it's comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And And on the fringe end of it are these people who say, if you don't believe what I believe, I hate you.
Mhm.
But in the main part of it is that you have to try to uh, gently talk to people about getting out of that comfort zone.
Mhm.
And really the unknown is looks frightening, but it's not a big deal to see both sides of an argument before you make up your mind. It's not that difficult. But
Mhm.
they see it as something that only professors or someone like
Mhm.
can do. I mean, it's just it's because they don't want to get out of that comfort.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, again, I don't want to mention any specifics to get any. I don't want to raise any specific controversial issues. So I'm going to be very vague and general here, but I definitely agree. Like, there's all types of sources of knowledge today, media, TV, whatever it is, and so it can make it very difficult to find truth. And I think it does start to become challenging because people can be overloaded with information from people or sources that they're comfortable with. And then they think they're seeing both sides when they're really not. So I do think today you have to be a little bit more proactive to find the other side of things. And then even then you have to kind of sift through what is opinion versus what is factual information. And so it makes it, I think today it is a little challenging. It does take a lot of effort in some instances of trying to find what the truth is, because so many people take truth and then load on top of it some mistruths or misinformation, making truth hard to know. They'll take little nuggets of truth and then surround it with things that aren't true. So I think it is hard, but I think that it's kind of imperative that we are trying to see both sides of things, from people who are um, everyone has some bias. You know, we all grow up in certain cultures, certain environments, certain families, and we're raised with certain opinions around us. So we all have some bias. We have to just recognize that bias is not in itself meaning that we're awful or evil, because we all have it. It's part of who we are. But recognizing what that bias is and then trying to find people with a different persuasion or a different view, and then listening. And then, like you said, Betty, really taking all different perspectives and trying to use that to come to truth, rather than just automatically accepting one particular authority because it's comfortable to you, or one particular person because they're charming or pretty, or one particular authority because it's your family or it's your friend or it's someone who thinks like you. Sometimes we do have a tendency to stick within groups who share common views with us because it's comfortable. But it's great to have friends from different perspectives. I think it makes you grow in your knowledge and view of the world. Like this book here, even, it really helped to expand my understanding of where subjectivists come from, and to view the world differently. There's another really good book that I had read recently too, that kind of has a similar approach, trying to show us how it is that certain people have these views today that they do. It's called, let me see, it's called The Rise and Fall, or The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Let me see. Let me see what it's, who the author. Yeah, it's called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's a big book, but it's by this guy named Carl Trueman. And I read it recently, and it also kind of has a similar, it's a little more academic, but it's written for like the average person, to try to introduce you to, I don't know if you can see this. Oh, nope, you can't. But anyway, it's called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And he tries to help us understand expressive individualism. To me, there's some roots of relativism and subjectivism in that, and how people have just over the past 30, 40, 50 years, past 100 years, have come to the worldviews they have. And so it's not that people are always choosing to be a subjectivist or relativist. Some people don't even realize that's their view of the world because it's been ingrained in them through their surroundings, their environment, through their culture. So we have to just kind of, when we approach anything, realize people aren't always holding a view they hold because they're evil or because it's they're trying to oppose the good. Most of the time, the majority of the time, they don't realize, the roots of what they hold have refutations, like in a objective worldview or a Christian worldview. Anyways, I've kind of digressed, but my point being that I do think it's really important we understand where people come from, we understand different perspectives and points of view, and don't demonize people who disagree with us. Listen to people, even people who I completely do not agree with their political persuasion. It's good to listen to people who are trying to come from common sense, who are trying to be logical and reasonable in how they present their arguments, and listen to them. I think we can learn a lot.
Yeah. Well, I'm all for today's technology because a lot of people aren't readers, and a lot of people who will read to a certain extent will not read a book like Abolition of Man. They get caught up in the fact that English education is so much better than ours, and so they're not used to someone speaking to them at the level at which Lewis is speaking at this point, and other of his academic books, which went right over my head. They were so, but now you can go and Google things like, I'm looking for something. Any topic you can just type in, I'm looking for, or what does it mean to do? I mean, you can just actually talk into Google and things will come up that actually, if you look, maybe you have to go to the second page, but yeah, that's what I meant. That's what I wanted to find out about. And I mean, you and I are obviously readers, but for those who aren't, that's Copaconia of opportunities to hear YouTube lectures or whatever and find out about things. And I use it myself. I mean, sometimes I'm absolutely amazed when I ask such a general question that I'm amazed it doesn't say, please use different words or something. No, they bring me there. So
yeah,
I think that that's a wonderful opportunity. I've been in Texas a long time, but I'm still a Yankee. And it is interesting when you say, I am very close to people who I don't agree with on a scale of practically anything you can think of. The only thing we have in common is we're searching for a deeper walk with the Lord. And that's enough. We can have a close relationship just on that. But we can't go to lunch together because I can't eat the food that they like, and they won't eat the food that I like. Let's just, put it that way.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, you just grow so much when you are just listen to other people. And like you said, technology, like with any technology, it can be used for our benefit. It can also be used and abused for our disadvantage. And so I think we have to realize that the technology is great. The internet can be great. We can find so much information. I mean, you can find the ancient books online in many cases. A lot of the church fathers, you can find their writings online. Thomas Aquinas, you can find it online. Aristotle. So you can find so much, but this same technology can be abused, where if you're looking for something, don't be surprised that sometimes you may find very biased, one-sided points or propaganda about certain topics. So you have to really be careful and discern the source that you're relying on for information, because sometimes those sources can be actually misinformation rather than promoting truth or promoting opinion as if it's fact. So you just have to be careful. But I think technology is wonderful, but
A lot of that goes on these days. But I also see that when I come upon those things, I find that it's interesting to know what these subjective ideologies that people are pushing. And if I don't know anything about it at all, I don't understand my own view better. I don't know if you understand what I mean by that. So I don't necessarily avoid when I go, let's say, on a general thing on Google, and God knows what comes up. And if I click on something thinking it's one thing and it's another, it still is information that I don't have to avoid, but I can use it to see what's out there, what's being propagandized. And to say that I 100% can discern the difference, no. Sometimes it's really hard, and I just have to ignore it because I can't trust myself in making a decision of anything about it. But basically, I think it can be a good thing as well as a bad thing. I mean, being blasted by medical advertisements, that's something that you should be very well aware of, and be terrible, because it says, ask your physician. So you put your physician in a situation where if they don't think it's really necessary, they are tempted to say, well, it wouldn't hurt you if you really want it. And because they don't want to get sued. And so, I mean, and they're very, very cleverly advertised. But some of them are really important. Some of them will advertise a medicine that's available to someone who can't get relief from the usual ones, and they would never have heard of it. And then they can go to their doctor and ask about it. But again, this is a place that you have to be very, very careful. I happen to put everything through my DVR so that I go through all the commercials, but you can't help but, I mean, if you stop too soon, 9 times out of 10, they're advertising some prescription these days.
Yeah.
And so, they're not going to kill you, but they're influencing you to throw your money down the toilet.
Hey, Matthew, do you have any comments on the book or anything you wanted to share?
It's been the best book I've ever read. I've never read anything like it before, ever.
Oh, wow.
So it's the most technical book I've ever read. Well, read, audible. But either way, it has a lot that I have to work on. Based on that book, I'm far from everything you all said right now, and I need to work on that like really bad.
Yeah.
But I did enjoy the book. It's again one of the most technical books I've ever read, and it's to understand what C.S. Lewis was saying. It's all those articles that you shared with us helped out to better understand certain parts of the book, and gave more light to it too. But I am amazed at how how it reflects today. A lot of this reflects today, and everything that's happening.
Mhm.
And there is a lot that I need to work on. Like I said, to be a better Christian and a better person towards others, especially having to do with our faith, Christianity in general. So, yeah. I'm sorry I missed last week's conference, but Zoom meeting. But I've been busy, and right now I'm busy right now doing a breakfast
No,
breakfast, yeah, for my ladies. So
No,
that's
that's
what I'm
okay.
doing.
Well, I appreciate your
Yeah,
comments. Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's definitely a challenging book. It's very difficult to read, and so some people
yeah,
never read it because of that.
yeah,
So that was
yeah.
one reason. That was one reason I really wanted to do it for the book club, because I was like, maybe we can make this book more reachable for people if we talk about it and read through it
I
together.
think you did a great job. I think you did a great job in explaining a lot of it, and you and Miss Betty, Betty or Betsy?
Betty,
Miss
Betty.
Betty, both of you are very, um, um, very very well at discussing these things, and I love the back and forth between you both. The both of you have been inspiring in this, like, big time.
Oh, good. Well, thank you, thank you.
Thank
But
you.
yeah,
Uh,
I'm glad you were able to stick through it and able to join us on Zoom as much as you have. I know it's family, so but we appreciate
yeah.
it.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm gonna mute.
Yeah, no
I'm
problem.
gonna, yeah, I'm gonna let you ladies keep speaking, and I'm gonna keep listening.
No problem.
Uh-huh.
I think you're on mute, Betty. Maybe.
He just so
Oh, there you
now.
go. Oh, okay, there you go.
Yeah. Well, I think we kind of got to the end of, or we could go on forever, but there it is.
Mhm. Uh-huh.
An hour, yeah. And
Yeah.
I don't know, do you have anything that you wanted to?
I mean, not specifically. I was gonna leave it open for comments and things like that. So yeah, no, not specifically. I don't have
No.
anything more. Let
No,
me.
I would like to encourage anybody that felt bogged down and stopped reading, that it it really, especially with all the YouTube help that there are, it's worth uh, struggling through this book, because it gives you a really interesting way of looking at what we believe and why we believe it, and the importance of having a objective truth to rely upon, which I think was the main takeaway from the book. But
Mhm.
definitely, it was not an easy book for me to read either. Um, uh, but it was worth the struggle.
Mhm. Yeah, same here. I definitely found it challenging. I had to use a lot of online resources and articles, everything that I shared with you guys to help me too. And but I think, I think C.S. Lewis would be glad that we've struggled through it to really see where he's trying to go and what he's trying to show us. And
He's a brilliant man,
mhm.
for sure.
He's brilliant. I mean, he is more
Yeah.
knowledgeable than most people even today that I know. I mean, he's incredibly knowledgeable, well educated. I mean, when all the he's well read, and as Betty had mentioned, he's written so many other things, some far more academic and difficult than this. But it's amazing how he can go from something like this to a book like Narnia that can reach millions and millions of people, but still sharing some of these same ideas with just even children. And so he has just this amazing ability to educate people of all different educational backgrounds, which is incredible.
Yeah, it takes a brilliant writer to write to 12-year-olds.
For sure. Yeah, and I think I agree with you. I think he wants us to take away a few things, that there's in this life, there's both an objective dimension and a subjective dimension, because we're human beings. We do have our different experiences, different emotions, different things that we can bring to the table, these subjective elements that are important, but we can't neglect the objective, the real, the true, the good, the beautiful. And the subjective dimension is something that if you ignore it, it's destructive. But I also think, like I found, like from being a Christian, that he also tries to help strengthen our grounding in this objective truth, to show us it's universal, that it's not just a Christian thing. And this is back to that appendix that he gives, where there's the Hindus, Confucius, the Jewish people, other pagans even. They've accepted some of these same objective truths. It helps us as Christians to even be more passionate, to embrace the objective moral law, the natural moral law, because it's true. And it's not true just because Christians say it, because the Bible says it, because the Catholic Church says it. The natural moral law is true because of God, because of how God created us as human beings, and of how God created this universe. And so to me, it's very, I don't know, it's powerful to see that this is something embraced by all cultures of all times throughout humanity. There is this realization that there is something that we can all agree on that's good and true and beautiful in this world. And it can get corrupted, and it can get misunderstood. And as time goes on, people can start to accept opposite views. But there is this, from all of the history of humanity, there's this kind of root grounding that we can have that's just powerful. And it can be great to have that as our starting point for conversations with people who are not Christian. This idea of this universal objective moral law that exists can be a great way to build a bridge, speaking with people who aren't Christian, speaking with atheists or others about this. And so that was another takeaway for me.
Yeah, it always amuses me.
Those that are willing to listen.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's really hard to speak to just anybody.
Mm-hmm.
I heard you ladies were speaking about online debates and stuff like that, and yeah, there's a lot of people there online that just aren't willing to see other people's faith, and it makes it hard to speak to those. And that's why I keep saying that's where I need to practice on that right there, because online it's extremely hard. Now in person, now it's a different story. You know, I got tons of friends that are I guess you could say agnostic, because they believe, but they don't believe in God Himself, and or our God, you know, Christianity God, Christians God, you know, Judaism, that God, you know, they just believe there's something out there, but they're not sure what it is. And it's better for me to talk to them than it is to people online. So I lost my train of thought.
That's okay.
So,
yeah, I think a lot of people have that. You know, online, the difficulty is that you don't have a relationship with a lot of people. And even if you do, you have this barrier of a computer. You have to be in the presence. You can say things that are a lot more disrespectful. You can say things that are rude. You also can make false judgments of people. Emotions. Whenever you say something in an email, even people can misinterpret what you're saying because they don't see the emotion behind it or the facial expressions. I mean, you may be saying something very charitably and they take it as something rude in an email because you didn't intend it that way, but that's how they interpreted it. And the same thing happens online. So I think you have to be really careful with the online conversations, because there's that lack of relationship. It's this illusory relationship. Social media does not create true relationships that are really grounded in people knowing each other to the extent of your person relationship. But I think there's a way to have discussions online, but there's also dangers. You have to be careful to not fall into some traps that are out there. And definitely there's people who don't want to listen, and it's not worth people who are so ideological and so obstinate and closed-minded, it's not worth reading. But I think sometimes like I'll engage sometimes with people, always in charity, but sometimes it's more for the people reading the comments, not so much for the person who started the conversation. So sometimes if I'm communicating with someone, let's say you have the person who started the post, maybe they're completely angry and obstinate, closed-minded. I may engage a little bit more for those reading the comments, not so much trying to change the mind of the post person. But you still have to be selective and be careful when you have those online conversations, because it is sometimes there's a trap being set for you to fall into, things
I
that
fall
just
into it a lot.
things can become incredibly emotional and not logical very quickly.
That's why I'm very, very selective, and I don't have any ego involvement in how many friends I have.
Yeah.
I saw this cartoon about this guy going to the church for a funeral memorial, and he saw two other people there. And he looked around and he said, I can't understand. He had 1,100 friends.
Yeah. Yep. It's definition of a true friend and a social media friend, and they're very different.
This
Yeah.
ego thing of getting a lot of friends. Yeah. And so,
yeah. I think social media definitely has some benefits to it in engaging with people, but it's not for everyone. And you have to be very careful
you really
because
do.
you have to be careful.
And I think it's happened to all of us, that I've sent a text or an email and it was taken in a way that I didn't mean it, because I wasn't able to express it face to face. But if you have any relationship with a person at all, you can correct it. But the book, it was really, really worth the effort.
Yeah, I agree. And thank you so much, Betty, for joining every time and all of your thoughts. Always very helpful. And I'm glad, Matthew, that you hung through it all. I know it was definitely challenging, but glad you were able to hang in there. And I know there's others who will watch this recording and they also hung in there too. So hopefully it's been worth it for everybody. But I think it's a book we can definitely go back to. And it's short enough. You can kind of reread the chapters, which was great to kind of help try to figure it out. But it's definitely written at an academic level, but it's worth trucking through and seeing his overarching ideas and points that he's making.
I do like the idea of coming back to it later. Maybe we can even understand it better and say more about it.
Yeah,
because
sure.
Like I'm telling you, I gotta reread the whole thing all over again. But what I captured, and with all the articles and stuff like that you've helped out with, it makes sense. Now I want to make sense of a bit more, about his writing. So I would like to see this book again in our book club.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you could, even that essay I sent out at the very beginning called The Poison of Subjectivism, that first essay we did, it's short enough. You could go back and reread that. It'll probably mean a whole.
That was hard.
It was very hard. It was challenging. I think that like now that you've seen the book, you can go back and read it and you'll see it pop out. You'll see what he was trying to get at with that essay too. But that poison of subjectivism. But yeah, he was writing these things very much for an academic audience. But it's something that I think even us who are far less academic and intellectual than C.S. Lewis was, but I think it's really worth there's value in understanding it and not getting caught up. So sometimes as you read this book, you get like, oh my gosh, I don't know what he's saying with that reference or that Latin phrase. It's okay to skip over sometimes things that you just don't get and try to really focus on what is the overall purpose of this chapter, of this paragraph. And then later you can come back to it. And I think it'll start to make more sense, some of those more difficult things that he says. But,
okay, I've got to go.
Yep, I do too. All right. Well, thanks again for joining us, and hopefully,
Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew.
I just have to leave. So someone
No, that's all right.
All right. It was good meeting you, Miss Betty. And I hope you both have a blessed and wonderful day.
Yeah, you too. And to everyone watching, have a great Sunday. Have a great week. Talk to you
All
later.
right. God bless.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.